Good morning, Jason. Thanks for joining us on Let's Talk Vets.
Good morning. Thanks for having me, Doug.
Okay, let's start with a layman's explanation of what you guys are attempting to do, and along the way, how the brain processes decision-making, and why that process varies from individual to individual, and how deCervo training can make a difference.
At kind of the high level, decision-making is something that's best described by a book by Daniel Kahneman. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. A lot of folks I know in law enforcement have come across this book, and it's started to percolate a little bit into sports. And that title, Thinking Fast and Slow, I think really describes the types of decisions that we make on a regular basis. Fast decisions. You're driving down the road and a deer pops out. You got to slam on the brakes instantly, right? That's a fast decision. You visually recognize something in the road. You connect that to a movement, in this case, your foot, to move from the accelerator to the brake, and you slam on the brakes. And it all happens in the space of about a second. Slow decisions. Slow decisions are like, should I move to the Delaware Valley? Should I move to the Hudson Valley? Should I move to Hancock? Should I move a little bit further downriver in Port Jervis? Do I like the school districts here? Do I like the school districts there? Those are kind of deliberate decisions where you kind of weigh your pros and cons. They happen in way longer time periods than a second. So thinking fast and slow is kind of the best way to describe decision making. And what deCervo does to advise on how to make those quick decisions, like how quickly do you recognize something in the road and slam on the brakes. Now, we don't work with drivers. We work with athletes. We work with law enforcement. And we've been working with the Army for the last almost 15 years. And we have an exciting new project there that we're getting into that's going to involve veterans.
All right, so co-founder is a fellow by the name of Jordan Maraskin. He's also a Ph.D. He's your chief technical officer and co-founder of deCervo. And you and Jordan met in 2010 at Columbia University in a lab. And I'm reasonably sure that you didn't say, hey, let's go get a couple of beers and figure out how to make people make fast decisions better. So how did the concept of training the brain to make better decisions quicker come about?
I wouldn't say Jordan was, too young to drink at the time, but he was just out of college when I met him. And he was a graduate student in the lab I joined. After my Ph.D., I had studied aerospace engineering at Georgia Tech, and I had started to make a move from aerospace engineering to how the brain works and how to design computer algorithms that can mimic aspects of how our brains do all sorts of wonderful things they do. After Ph.D., I was looking for a lab to work on this area. Because of that background that I didn't have in neuroscience, it was kind of tough to find a job. But Columbia, here in New York, took a chance on me. And so I started working there as a postdoctoral research scientist in 2010. I joined this lab. It's called the Laboratory for Intelligent Imaging and Neural Computing. That was run by Professor Paul Scheida. And that lab was right at the intersection of those two areas I was interested in, how the brain works and how we use computer algorithms to figure that out. His lab was focusing on fast decisions, those decisions that are like less than a second. Think of the deer on the road. I didn't really have any way of understanding what this meant. So because I was coming from outside of this area, I was looking at what they were doing from very fresh eyes. Jordan had done his undergraduate in biomedical engineering, and he was continuing on to his PhD. So he's very much had a lot of experience in this area, and he's developed a lot of technical expertise about how to write computer code, integrate the various ways of measuring brain activity. So I was coming in as total novice in this area, and Jordan is what our professor Paul Scheida would refer to as MacGyver. He would always figure out these incredible technical solutions for problems that we were looking at in terms of how you measure the brain and how you look at the decision-making process. So when I joined the lab in 2010, I leaned on the things that I knew. I have a pretty strong background in music. I've played piano my whole life. So that was kind of what I leaned on in the early days of figuring out what was going on in the lab at Columbia. So I thought, what are quick decisions like in music? It gave me a foundation to think when I hear a mistake in a piece of music, I instantly will recognize that. If there's a wrong note, if you're at a recital and you hear a wrong note for a piece you know very well, you instantly can recognize it. But somebody who doesn't have that kind of experience playing that piece or with music may not recognize a mistake like that. So I thought about quick decision making in that context. And that was how I started learning how we measure the brain response when you recognize, in this case, a mistake, or when you make a quick decision, which is kind of a similar thing in this context. Have you ever watched in the movies when they show a scene where you're doing a lie detector test and there's somebody watching the scribble of those little arms that are putting ink showing your pulse, and then they're marking on that piece of paper that's rolling by them when they ask a certain question? It's kind of like with the EEG, when you measure brain activity on the head. You're basically introducing a question. In this case, you're playing a piece of music and you insert a wrong note. And then you look at what are the squiggles like on the piece of paper as it's going by you. In the case of EEG, it's all captured digitally. And so you take these computer algorithms to then figure out where the squiggles in that brain activity look different from hearing a wrong note to hearing how the piece should actually be played. And so from that kind of experiment, that kind of way of looking at brain response in people who had musical ability and people who didn't, there was a clear difference in the brain response of people who had musical ability and people who didn't. And so I presented those early results within the first year at the lab at Columbia. And Jordan was working on a totally different project. He's, like I said, MacGyver. And so he was putting together EEG, which is electrical measurement, with MRI, which is measuring resonance changes in your brain. And if anybody remembers from high school physics, electricity induces magnetism, and magnetism induces electricity. So if you're measuring those two ways of seeing what's going on in the brain at the same time, it's very technically challenging. And so he was working on a problem like that with something that had nothing to do with music, nothing that had to do with baseball, nothing. But he saw what I was doing with the musicians. And the context of this is that he's from New York. I'm from Chicago. He's a Yankees fan, and I'm a Cubs fan. So I knew he had an interest in baseball. But other than that, we didn't really have much in common until this music study, until he saw these differences in musical experts recognizing mistakes versus musical novices. And after that meeting in the lab, he came up to me and said, "Hey, why don't we do this in sports?" And so our first experiment was in baseball. But that's kind of the nuts and bolts of how we met and how we got into studying baseball hitters' brains.
So initially you applied it to sports because it's something that a lot of people can relate to. But I'd like to start with just an example of looking at hitting. Now, it seems to me that to do a study, you would have to establish an empirical baseline. But then again, everybody's different, so I guess it's a baseline according to that person, and you're putting them through a series of stimuli to see how their brain reacts and to establish that baseline?
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. Like the lie detector test analogy, if I sit down for a lie detector test and you sit down for a lie detector test, it's going to look like a different set of squiggles, whether we're telling the truth or not, because you'll have an underlying different kind of cardiovasculature than I will. And so my squiggles on the lie detector test are just going to look different than yours, whether either of us is telling the truth or not. And so if you're looking to change performance of the individual over time, you need that baseline to start. In the case of our early research at Columbia, was there we weren't doing a longitudinal kind of like over time baseline and then training. We were actually at the time just seeing what are the basic differences between this group of people who are 18 to 22-year-old men who have not played baseball and this other group of people who are 18 to 22-year-old men who have played baseball their whole life and are playing on a Division I Ivy League team. So in that case, we had two very well-formed groups of experts, the hitters, and the non-athlete, random population of men who were the same age at the school. So the baseline in that case was kind of the non-athletes to compare to the athletes to see what parts of the brains of the hitters were unique to how they reacted to, instead of, questions like a lie detector, in this case, how they reacted to making decisions on pitches. So fastballs, on curveballs that we simulated for them in a video screen, and they would press buttons on a computer to tell us if they thought it was a fastball or a curveball or whatever. And the interesting thing about that is that you don't even need them to have a bat in their hand to do this, because their brains and nervous systems have over time learned what these types of pitches look like, so that you kind of elicit this cascade of neural activity, of nervous system activity. And so when you see something that's reminiscent of something you do when you're physically holding a bat, it elicits this whole chain of events that are like what you have happen out on the field. And so we could actually see in this comparison of the baseline being the non-players to the players group, we could see the difference of how the brains of those hitters were uniquely honed over time to have this skill of recognizing pitch types. And so in that case, that's where the baseline was like one snapshot in time between novices and experts. And we did that with the musicians as well. But in the case of training, you establish a baseline for just one person. And that's kind of the basis of all of the products that deCervo makes for baseball hitters, softball hitters, for the NHL, to train their new referees and linesmen, and for law enforcement to train mostly new cadets and in-service training for younger officers, so like within the first 1 to 5 years. And in each of those cases, we establish a baseline of ability. So for hitters, how well they see curveballs, sliders, fastballs, you name it, how well they recognize different parts of the zone, how quickly they do that, right? All on a computer screen or on a phone app. And then with UCall, our NHL referee product, similar. In that case, though, instead of looking at pitches coming at them, they're looking at games that happen in the NHL where there are certain incidents happen that could be penalties or could not. And the question is how quickly they recognize and what activity they recognize on the screen. And that's the baseline. And similarly with E-Train for our police and law enforcement training, it's how well do they recognize cues, body language cues, other things like that, conversational cues from interacting with somebody that's recorded on a body camera that tells us how well they're picking up the decisions in that environment. So with every single one of those cases, baseball, softball, hockey, police, it's all about how quickly and accurately do you process visual and auditory, audio, sound information and make decisions on those things. And from that baseline, then we start, trying to hone where the strengths are and eliminate some of the weaknesses.
Okay, I find the law enforcement particularly interesting. In baseball, what's the worst that can happen? You strike out. And in law enforcement, there's all sorts of unintended and bad consequences that happen. And in today's environment, where we've had some overreaction due to some unfortunate things that have happened in this country, portraying law enforcement as the enemy because we're human, we make mistakes, and some of those mistakes can be tragic. Do you have any feedback from law enforcement as to the effectiveness of what this can do for their officers in avoiding bad decisions?
It's not just about like avoiding bad decisions. The bad decisions are the ones that we see on evening news, or we see all over social media when they happen. We just had the anniversary of George Floyd. The 8 minutes and a certain number of seconds as the focus of that interaction, leaning on George Floyd's neck. But there's almost an hour worth of surveillance footage and other footage of the entire interaction from the store to eventually what ended up happening when George Floyd died. And there are numerous decisions that the officers made in that environment that led up to the ultimate one that everybody knows about. So rather than just focusing on avoiding bad decisions, we're also focused on the numerous other decisions that happen in an interaction, from the moment you pull somebody over to the moment you encounter somebody on the street. It doesn't have to end up in the use of force, is what I'm saying. And there are decisions about body language, how you react to tone of voice, how you identify whether you have probable cause for search. And in New York State particularly, they have levels. They're called the Terry laws. And so they have various levels they have to go through in terms of identifying probable cause to do a search. Obviously, how free speech things interact, getting into constitutional questions. And so those types of decisions all precede, what they call bang. So for all those decisions before. And the feedback that we've gotten is great. Well, I'm in Pennsylvania, but in New York, up in Syracuse, their academy was using E-Train, and they're a regional academy for Onondaga. And we had some really great results there in terms of seeing officers integrate lessons that they were getting in the academy and then decreasing their decision time, but maintaining their accuracy or even increasing their accuracy in decisions over the course of that academy and the training period. Talking about bad decisions, you can have the flip side of having decision hesitancy. And that's something that is particularly dangerous for officer safety. As much as you don't want law enforcement officer to make a bad decision, you also don't want them to make a no decision in a case that could be life-threatening to someone in the community or to themselves. Famous example of a no decision is the school shooting in Uvalde. The officers held back, for some time, and the parents were justifiably going crazy outside, asking why they're not going in, pleading with them to go in. We had a situation with one of our academies. I won't say who it is. It was a repeat cadet in the academy. He or she, we don't know their identity, had been through the academy already, but was repeating the course because they noticed in the field this officer had decision hesitancy. They would usually follow behind the other officer's decisions. We're going to arrest. Okay, now we go into arrest, right? Rather than taking the lead. We didn't know this when the academy started. And about 3 or 4 weeks into the training period with E-Train, the training sergeant runs the instruction in the academy, brought this up with us. And I said, take a look at Officer 2. So we looked at Officer 2. He says, what do you see with Officer 2? And what we could see was that in decisions where it's simple, like yes, no, true, false, those types of things. Can you apply the Fourth Amendment here or not? True, false, right? Versus decisions that are like multiple choice, A, B, C, or D. You got a lot of things to choose from. And that's kind of how life is, particularly in law enforcement. The multiple choice decisions, much slower, much less accurate than the true, false for this particular officer. And so that was what we could see on our end. So that told us that that kind of decision hesitancy was showing up also with how they interacted with scenarios on body cam in E-Train. So the training sergeant asked us straight up, is this person a lost cause or not? When we analyzed that set of data, we said, well, we don't know. But when this officer knows the answer, he or she executes it basically instantaneously within a couple of seconds. But when they get multiple choices to look at, they're seeing multiple choices rather than zooming in right away on what the right answer is. So what our hope is that as they go through this training that we do that adjusts to their ability as they go along, again, have the baseline and it adjusts to them. Our hope is that it'll give them scenarios that are more matched to their abilities in the various categories of law enforcement that you have. Use of force decisions, constitutional policing, vehicle stops, etc. So that if you're really good at vehicle stops, let's say you're a 9 out of 10 on vehicle stops, but you're a 1 out of 10 on use of force, the next scenario, the next body cam based scenario you're going to see on E-Train is going to be a really hard vehicle stop type scenario next. But you were 1 out of 10 on use of force decisions, you're also going to be prioritized to get a scenario that's got a very easy use of force type decision in it. And so in that kind of way, you gradually build up the officer from their baseline. And that's kind of the training that went into this particular officer with the decision hesitancy. Now, this officer has been back on the road for about 6 months now. And, we try to do anecdotal type follow-ups with leadership and training sergeants and lieutenants and stuff like that. But it's much more difficult to validate data-wise what we do in law enforcement, aside from a CompStat type, comprehensive look at a department, because there are no baseball cards on police officers. We work with a minor league player in the Rangers organization. We work with a minor league player in the Mariners organization. We can find their season stats through yesterday online, like looking up a baseball card. But with law enforcement, there's nothing like that. So we don't have that kind of, in the field way of measuring what's translating and what's not, other than what the training sergeant, what the lieutenants tell us. And so far, that kind of feedback we've gotten of what they're doing in the field has been quite exceptional. And even in kind of role play scenarios too, where they can observe even more, details.
And that seems like a natural segue to, it looks like it's good to involve the coaches and managers or supervisors in the process as well, so that they can better evaluate what their line operatives or their line people are doing.
That's correct. I'd say it's instrumental. Whether it's a training sergeant or lieutenant in law enforcement, whether it's a coach in baseball or softball. With the NHL, it's the officiating department, so the director of officiating. A real visionary in this area, Stephen Walcom. He's a veteran NHL official for many years. Officiated in the Stanley Cup playoffs. He has driven it at the NHL. The Texas Rangers are one of our clients. The coach who runs that, the director of hitting, he's instrumental in terms of leading this, because doing it on a phone app, which is how a lot of our training functions, is you do a lot of things on your phone. You call people, you text people, you WhatsApp, you Instagram, you Snapchat, you do all these things on your phone. But to see your phone as a tool for professional development is not such a familiar concept yet. But it's really the Swiss Army knife of today, your smartphone. And in our case, it's actually the best way to deliver this kind of assessment, baselining, and then ongoing training. I know in sports, for instance, particularly with youth sports and college even, and you see with professional too, they're trying to limit screen time for the players. Get outside, get fresh air, that kind of stuff, because there's a ton of negative association with being on the phone. What most of that time is being on the phone is interacting with social media apps, and it's hyper social comparison usually that's happening in that case, and lead to things like teenage depression and even suicide, and other really bad things. But the phone, on the other hand, is a fantastic tool for being able to slightly change a baseball pitch's speed, slightly change a baseball pitch's break, so that, like I talked about before, the officer who's doing, and back in policing, the officer that's doing 9 out of 10 on vehicle stops and 1 out of 10 on use of force, that we can then adjust and pick what the next scenario, next body-worn camera video he sees and interacts with based on that baseline ability. We could do that also in baseball. So if you're able to hit an 84-mile-an-hour fastball that's got a little bit of break to it, let's pump that up to 86 and put a little more, cut in that fastball, right? That's something you can do digitally on a phone or on a computer screen that you just can't really do in real life. If anybody's thrown batting practice for their high school team, their college team, little league, they know it's not that easy to put the pitch exactly where you want it. But you can do that digitally with zero effort. Really, where the effort of the coach is, though, is to make a habit for the player of doing this kind of training regularly. That's really the role of a coach, of a parent even. Earlier this week, I ran into a realtor in the area, and her daughter plays softball. We were talking about her hitting and her working with the app. And I said, I'll be quite honest with you. you're going to have to check in with her to see that she's doing this, because that's really where we see the most success is with the coaches or the parents, or in the case of law enforcement, the training sergeants are making this like something that you should do on a regular basis and checking in on the progress. If it's just put in your hand and we come back in a year after, nobody's happy. The team's not happy because, they spend a lot of money. The players aren't happy because they're confused. They don't know what this thing is and why they were supposed to do it. And then we're not happy because we weren't able to actually develop the skill that we've been able to develop in hundreds of other hitters and in increasing numbers of law enforcement over the years.
Okay, so we've got a very basic understanding of what you guys have come up with. You're working with our Department of Defense for quite a while and extending these concepts and training to our military. In what regard are we doing that?
So when I first started at Columbia, I joined a project that was supported by the Department of Defense, particularly an agency within DoD called DARPA. That's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They do a lot of things. They were doing a program at the time on using neurotechnology, so how you analyze brain activity with technology, to help image analysts, like surveillance imagery. You'll have a big database of pictures to look through, basically find bad guys or signs of bad guys. So the idea was to make a program with neurotechnology for finding the bad guys faster. It's the best way I can describe it. So that was kind of my introduction to that. I've known for years that a lot of the best scientific research is done in support of defense. Even back when I was at Georgia Tech in this fellowship program named for Senator Sam Nunn, in that program we were taught to look at the overlap between policy decisions and scientific progress. And so there's a rich history of that in the country, really going back to World War I and then really accelerating in World War II and then in the Cold War. So, I had some awareness of that, but it wasn't really until joining the lab at Columbia that I saw it in action. And in 2011, I pivoted over to a different project that was with the Army Research Lab. The Army Research Lab is primarily based in Aberdeen Proving Ground. So the Army Research Lab had a growing neuroscience and neurotechnology focus at the time, and it just turned out to be the right place, right time. The professor of the lab at Columbia, Paul Scheida, had been doing research work with defense. That's how it ended up in the DARPA project. And the Army Research Lab looked to him as somebody who could, contribute to the research effort. And I was kind of the bridge in that. So I was splitting time between Army Research Lab in Aberdeen and Columbia in New York. It was a period of time when all the basic research that eventually led to deCervo happened, that interface between defense work and our research at Columbia. So that was kind of the foundation I had personally with the Army. And even after my postdoc ended at Columbia and I was a professor at Downstate State University for about a year in neuroscience, that work kind of continued. But around that time, we had started deCervo kind of on the side. So I was still working with the Army in that particular way. Fast forward to 2017, we'd worked with some Major League Baseball teams at that point. Nothing in umpiring, nothing in officiating, certainly nothing in law enforcement. And the Army Research Office got in touch. We put together a little proposal for our research work. Starting in 2017, deCervo became a grantee from the Army Research Office. The focus of that research, I think I best summarize it as national pastime in support of national defense. And what I mean by that is it was all research on baseball for the most part, but it's all figuring out concepts that can apply to national defense. We were looking at all these things we talked about earlier, Doug, like how a hitter recognizes a pitch, what's going on in their brain, what that data looks like, how that relates to what's going on field, because it's a great analogy to what they'd like to do in defense, which is have training, have simulation of events, and improve decision-making of the warfighter to be able to operate optimally in a warfighting environment. And so that concept of looking at a simulation of the experience, how you decide in that environment versus what you do on the field, where it's the real experience of the pitch coming at you and you having to make decisions, was a perfect analog for a research project for the Army. 2017, I'd say through 2021 was when that basic research project was going on with deCervo and the Army. We were starting to see results, being able to train and move the needle on a baseline to another state of ability, and seeing that translate to real life settings. In other words, on the field. We're talking about baseball. And since then, we've expanded that out into the other areas where we do simulation and train decisions. So we've kind of expanded out that research project, initiating another grant period. Now it's a 3-year project instead of just, chunks of 1 years, that will look at expanding out to decisions beyond baseball, expanding to decisions that involve video of encounters. So think like law enforcement or the hockey officials even, because there we're getting to decisions that are not as clear cut, strike ball, swing or miss, hit or not hit. They're much grayer areas, right? Does the Fourth Amendment apply in this case as a law enforcement officer, for instance? And that's something that's much closer to application in DoD. And so where that's kind of positioned us over the last several years is that we've had ongoing conversations with various other parts of the Army and DoD to see if what we've found with baseball hitters and softball hitters and hockey officials and police officers can apply to training the warfighter. Warfighters cover a whole broad range of things. And the particular thing that we recently got connected with a couple of years ago was the Picatinny Arsenal, which is in New Jersey. And that's where they test a lot of big guns. That's where they design the gunnery. So the platform that you stand on, the shape of the shielding, the shape of the barrel, everything is all designed there and tested there. And the director of that program met us through our program manager at Army Research Office. And he said, you know what? I'd like to talk, because when we design gunnery, we're designing ways of cutting metal, basically. How long do we make the barrel? How much shielding do we provide? Where do we provide a slit so you can see outside? How do we design the mechanism to turn the platform? Like imagine like kind of on a Humvee or something, or on an Abrams tank. But we're not measuring and designing around the person and the decisions that the person can make. And so when you're identifying good guys and bad guys, that's critical. And how that information is processed, and then how you interact with the turret in that case. So that's really kind of the genesis of a project that started last year in a congressional submission, and we're continuing that this year. We're based in Pennsylvania 8, so that's through Congressman Cartwright's office. But Congressman Molinaro is on the other side of the river in New York, and we had worked with, at the time he was Congressman Delgado, now he's Lieutenant Governor's office. And we've continued with the support of Mark's office to try to get this project supported. And our senators on the Pennsylvania side, both Casey and Fettterman's offices, have been supportive of us in this pursuit as well. So that's the next phase, really, of where we're going with how well you hit a baseball, how well you hit a softball, how well you make calls on the ice, or how well you identify whether you can apply a search and the Fourth Amendment is satisfied in this case. The next step of that really is to expand out into how do we design a platform that is going to take into account decision-making ability of the gunner and optimize their ability to identify good guys and bad guys.
It's a fascinating story. I mean, there's all kinds of things that come to mind, which I won't delve into because we'll be here for another 3 or 4 hours. Not that it's not worth it, but we only have X amount of time on the radio.
Well, that's how life is. You only got a limited amount of it.
And because we only have a little time, I want to make the best decision that I can. So being your work with DoD, I would imagine that military expertise is valuable, and there may be, at some point, some employment opportunities for veterans or those that are rotating out of the military, fulfilling their contract and looking for some meaningful work. How do they get in touch with you? Who do they call? What do they do?
This last project that I talked about with gunnery is an opportunity for that, because in the case of baseball, I had played through high school. In case of hockey, I kind of had to learn as we went along, but I watched enough of the Blackhawks growing up to kind of know what slashing was or tripping. But in the case of gunnery, we don't really have any experience in that. And in law enforcement, I didn't have any experience in it. And so we've relied on people who do have experience in these areas to tell us what it's like, describe for us what it's like, give us an insight so that we can then apply our understanding of how the brain and nervous system works in those environments. And with gunnery, it's no different. And this project for the gunnery will be highly valuable for us to and work with veterans who have experience in the gunnery, particularly, a tank, Humvee. If there are other applications, which platforms we apply this to will really depend on basically how big of a check our congressmen and women can get for us. But it will be valuable for us, regardless of the type of gunnery experience you have, to be able to tell us, what's the experience like? Show us what it's like. Come with us to Picatinny Arsenal. Point out things that we may not know about, and basically be a technical advisor working with us on this project. We're anticipating at least 6 pretty well-paying technical jobs for veterans in this area, up to about 15 other technical and administrative, staff type jobs if this is allocated to us. And so it can be a great impact, not only for the Delaware Valley area, potentially also a little bit into Hudson Valley, but particularly on the Delaware Valley side, to give veterans a way of continuing to serve in a way that's more safe than active duty, but really being, that continued service to the country and being able to really still do what you guys do best. It's a project that's got a lot of support from Wayne County. All 3 county commissioners have supported this. And Congressman Cartwright's office, Congressman Molinaro's office are very supportive of giving veterans a role after service, after active service. So the way to take part in that is to contact us, email to info@decervo.com, DECERVO. Just put Doug's name in the subject line so we know that you heard us on the air here. And we'll give you the update in terms of kind of what we're looking at for the timeline. As you may see on the news, there's all sorts of hair pulling that goes on in Washington when it comes to congressional budgets. But we're optimistic that this will be supported in some way or another, because we see so many benefits for the gunnery. We see so many benefits for the county and for the 2 districts that border the river over here, Pennsylvania 8 and New York 19. So again, it's info@decervo.com, DECERVO.com. And best way to find our, some background on us also is at decervo.com.
All right, Jason Sherwin, co-founder of deCervo, and just a remarkable story and something worthwhile for the military and veteran community in the Hudson Valley to take note of. We thank you so much for your time, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Have a great day.